this video, I'm going to share all the techniques I use when I create my gouache paintings. Gouache is my favourite paint medium to use, and I'll be explaining why throughout the video. First, I'm going to give you the best tips on how to use the paint and the equipment. If you've got pre-opened packets like I do, then you might end up with dry, crusty paint like this. But don't worry, because you can easily get rid of this just by adding a little bit of water to the paint. You can pour it straight in if you're brave, but I like to use a thick watercolour brush that can hold lots of drops at a time and just drop it in one by one like that. Then just give it a good mix and it'll be good as new. With some brands of paint, however, you might encounter the issue of streaky, weird lines if you use a pure colour straight out the packet, as you can see here. You can just add a tiny bit of white if that's the exact colour you use, or just any colour if you're mixing it, but always add at least a little drop of water to thin out your paint a little bit, because it will just apply a lot more smoothly. You can see that difference here quite clearly. You always want to make sure when painting that you have two sets of water pots, one to wash all of the dirty paint off your brush, and one that's just clear water to use to thin out your paint and to mix with. And when it comes to washing your brush, you might want to do it like this. I know it looks a bit weird, but this way all of the colours won't splatter around the whole of your sink and make a mess. If this is your first time using gouache, I recommend choosing a picture to copy that has a variety of techniques and textures in it, like this one here that I'll be using today. This is a piece by Pablo Picasso, as you could probably tell, and you want to make sure all your sketch lines are nice and faint because gouache is transparent, so dark lines could still be visible at the end. You might want to use layers of paint for a sky, like I'm doing here, but you want to make sure that your bottom layer, which is your faintest layer, is as thin as possible, because if you use thin paint on top of thick paint, the water will just reactivate it and you won't be able to get any textures on top of it. It will just be a big blur. This is because water reactivates dry paint, which can be super useful. I'm using that technique here in order to kind of blend out the texture so it's not so harsh. But in general, you shouldn't apply thin paint on top of thick paint, only thick paint on top of thin paint. You can also use wet paints of the same thickness next to each other and they'll have a nice blendy effect all the way through. I used that quite early on to get those blue shades onto the brownish sky. Another way of adding texture to your paint is by getting a dry, completely dry, bone dry brush on top of wet paint and using it to lift some of the colour so that you can get lighter patches. This might be helpful for creating the texture on fabrics. You can also use small, thin brushes to create little textures. I've done that on the big brown blob up there. You can see I've used a dark brown and a little bit of cross-hatching. What I'm doing now is adding blocks of dry colour over this white background and then going in with plain water that hasn't got any paint or pigment in, and I'm using that to blend out the edges. As you can see here, it works really well, and this is a quality you only find in gouache. Another reason this is so useful and why I love gouache so much is because it means you don't have to constantly remix your colours like you do with acrylics if your palette dries up, because you just add a little bit of water and it reactivates the colours and you can use it. Its washiness is good for covering large areas, but it can also create really smooth, fine lines for smaller details. And I suppose that's true for acrylics and watercolours as well, but they're harder to use. And if you can already use both of those things, I would still recommend trying gouache because it's always good to learn a new set of skills on a new medium. And you never know, if you're good at watercolours, you might be even better at gouache. I often find with painting, sometimes the colours can get a little bit muddy and you can lose the tonal range somewhat. So what I like about gouache is that you can get a slightly thinned white paint on your brush and just add back in the lighter tones, and I did that quite a lot on the kind of brownish blue pole thing, but also the sky. The only complaint I have about my set of gouache paints is that the white isn't pure white, and I think that is just the case with all paint though, because I got acrylics out and they were also the exact same shade of white, which is that sort of browny off-white, and that really frustrated me. So what I ended up doing for the little dish, I ended up just using the plain white of the paper, so you might want to do that. But because the layers of gouache are so thin, you can easily correct colours that go awry simply by adding a thinner coat over the top that corrects it to the right colour. I think most gouache paints come with 2 sets of white, so I'd recommend maybe having one set of white that you use for mixing, because that's bound to get like scraps of other coloured pigments and that's going to distort the white a bit, but one set of white that you only ever use just for pure white, and that might help to avoid the issue that I had a bit. If yours also comes in those weird packets at the beginning that are like little trays, then try to only open it at the very corner, and this will reduce the chance of it going crusty and nasty like I showed you to start with. Another downside that I found with using gouache that you don't have with watercolours is that sometimes I'd get a bit of colour in the wrong place, and with watercolour what I normally do is just add a load of water which absorbs the pigment, and then I use a kitchen towel to just blot it away, and it's like there was no colour there. That doesn't work with gouache, however, and you can always see kind of like a shadow of the colour that was there anyway. So it's important to note that while gouache has many benefits, it isn't completely perfect. I think gouache is specifically suited quite well to portraits because skin tones can be blended so easily and you don't have to worry about them drying and having to remix them. That is such a pain with acrylics. What I'm doing now is combining the gouache with coloured pencils just to access those teeny tiny spots that I wouldn't be able to reach, and also because you can't blend gouache onto like the white of paper, you need to blend it into the white of more paint. I'm using it to add all of the sort of colour variation, the tonal variation on the dish, which as I said I left unpainted. So you could consider that as a mixed media approach in your own work. On the topic of medias, it's really important that you use the right surface to paint on. I would recommend watercolour paper. I'm not using watercolour paper here, I'm just using quite a high GSM. I'd recommend using at least 200 GSM, but 150 should sort of work, but definitely don't use anything like printer paper. Watercolour paper obviously will work really well because it's built for kind of water-based mediums like this. However, I wouldn't recommend painting onto a canvas with gouache unless you're using really thick layers or lots and lots of layers, because of the like texture of the canvas. It will just look really bumpy and not very smooth. So it's like you wouldn't use watercolour straight onto a canvas either. And another thing to note about gouache is that it doesn't really have much of a texture to it physically, whereas things like oil and acrylic, you can kind of build layers to kind of create more 3D elements with kind of ridges and stuff. That doesn't work with gouache because it's so smooth, so that's either a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're trying to achieve with it. Personally, I quite like a nice smooth finish, and I like to be able to add sort of colour by number style blocks of colour and then blend them all together afterwards. I find that really satisfying and also a lot easier than trying to keep paint wet. And that is the end of the tutorial. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you've got any more questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them in the comments below. If you're looking for tutorials on critical studies like this or mixed media in general, I've got many videos for that, but I hope to see you next time. Bye!